We are continuing in our series on Ezra and Nehemiah. Girls, if you can start handing those out. We have these little pamphlets. If you got one last week and you've got it, great. If you would like one for this week, they grab one from these lovely ladies helping me out, passing those out. So we are in a series on the books of Ezra, Nehemiah. I am enjoying this series. It's fun to do something that is a bit more unfamiliar. I was thinking about these books of Ezra. We're doing a few chapters of Ezra this week. It's a bit like the Ezra and Nehemiah. These are not the meat and potatoes of your preaching series, right? Like a hamburger, cheeseburger, pizza, tacos. They're on every menu because they're good. And it's like those are your go-to things at a restaurant. Like that's probably what you order. The chicken sandwich, the hamburger, the pizza. Ezra Nehemiah is not those things. Ezra Nehemiah is that special on the menu that sounds really interesting, but maybe you've never really had it before. And yeah, most of the time you probably go for the cheeseburger, and that's great. The cheeseburger's good. And after we preach Ezra and Nehemiah, we will probably go back to the pizza and the cheeseburger, which is like the Gospels, Philippians, Jonah a bit more in the sort of like familiar go-to. And there are a reason they're familiar and they're go-to. They're important. They're good. They're excellent. We love them. But every now and then it's nice to order the special and try something different. And maybe you learn something that you've never learned before. You taste something. There's a texture you've never had before. So Ezra, Nehemiah, thanks for ordering the special with us as we go through this sermon series. Try something different. Learn something new. It's a more difficult sermon series. It's more difficult to preach. Dave and I, it's been fun to just chat together and sort of learn as we go, sort of what is in here. Reading through a book of the Bible is different than preaching through a book of the Bible. You're sort of investigating it a little bit more. You're studying it more deeply, but it's more difficult. So many of the stories that we get to read really preach themselves, right? You do the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the raising of Lazarus, even Jonah. It's sort of like those texts just preach themselves. And a book like Ezra and Nehemiah with their odd names, it takes a little bit more work as a preacher, but it also takes more work as a congregation, as someone listening as well. And I guess I want to encourage you in that way. During this sermon series, maybe bring your hard copy of your Bible along to make notes in it. Maybe bring a journal, something you can write down with. It's going to take more work for you to listen and to receive during this sermon series. So I guess I'm asking you to muck in with us and to do that work. And the last thing I'll say is it will probably be a while before you hear another sermon series on Ezra. If you're at Harborside, I don't know when we'll do Ezra again. It will be a very long time. And if you move on to another church, it's still probably going to be some time before you have an opportunity to dive deep into these two books of our scriptures. But they're rich, and there's stuff if we work together and mine it. So I guess don't miss this opportunity. This may be the one chance in your life to read Ezra, to mine it, to understand it. So take some notes and follow along with us. What were you made for is the subtitle for this series. Think of a time in your life when you felt as though you were doing exactly what you were created to do. For me, what comes to mind is the summer of 2009 when I worked at a summer camp, and I came home from that summer, and I went to my mom and I said, I think I was made to do that. And she's recounted that story to me. And I can't live at summer camp forever. You have to move on with your life. But there's something about that summer that just felt like, gosh, that's what I was made to do. There's something about that summer that was just what I was made to do. Is there a job you had? Maybe it was a holiday you took. Maybe it was just a day where you felt like, oh, that's what I was made to do. That's what I was made for. It was the perfect combination of your skills and your gifts and your joy and your passions. Maybe you've never had that experience. That could be possible. What were you created to do? Before we jump into chapter 4, which is where we are in our series, this morning we're going to do chapters 4, 5, and 6 together of Ezra, which is a bit of a departure from what's on that little sheet. We're already editing it as we go along. So we're doing 3 chapters this morning. It'll make sense as we get there. But we've got to set the scene. You know, Dave preached on 1, 2, and 3 last week. In chapter 1, oh, where's my little clicker? Here it is. So in chapter 1, Cyrus sends God's people back. So the book of Ezra, Nehemiah, in our Bibles, it's a bit confusing. Ezra and Nehemiah are towards the front of the Bible in the first half, but they should really be right before the New Testament in our Bibles, because we're sort of coming to the end of the Old Testament. We've had Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We've had the Psalms. We've had the Kings, the Judges. We've gone through all of that, and now God's people are in exile. And the material of Ezra and Nehemiah is happening right before we get to this break in history, before Jesus is born in the New Testament. So God's people are in exile. They've been taken to Babylon. Persia has come into power, and Cyrus, the king of Persia, the king of kings, he's called, writes down on these cylinders in cuneiform. Dave showed this picture last week. This is in the British Museum. Writes down in cuneiform on these cylinders an edict that people can return to their homelands. And so this also includes God's people, the Israelites, are able to return to their homeland. In chapter 2 of Ezra, we're told who it is that returns. So there's a select group of Israelites that take up the opportunity and march and head their way back to Jerusalem. We're introduced to Zerubbabel. Say Zerubbabel. Well done, Zerubbabel. I don't know how would Australians shorten Zerubbabel? Zeb. Maybe we'll just call him Zeb. That's good. Yeah, Zeb. And Joshua. Not Joshua from the story of Jericho. This is Joshua, son of Jehozadak. So Zerubbabel is a blood relative of the last king of Judah, which is why Cyrus taps him and says, you're the governor, you lead people back. So Zeb leads the people back along with Joshua, and Joshua's sort of the spiritual leader. So Zeb and Joshua lead God's people back, and we get a long list of who goes back in chapter 2. So that's who those characters are. Dave said next week he might start with a quiz. He told me that, so just pay attention, okay? Zeb and Joshua lead the people back, chapter 2. Chapter 3, they get to work. God has sent them back to build up Jerusalem and to build the temple in particular. So they build the altar and they build the foundation, and they get there, and there's a mixture of joy and tears, because Jerusalem is not what it once was. And the temple that they begin to build is nothing compared to Solomon's temple. So there is weeping, but they're also back in their homeland. They're back where they belong. And so there's great joy and there's weeping. So we come to chapter 4, and so now the altar's built, the foundation's built. Let's start building the temple. Chapter 4, here we go. Confrontation, conviction, resilience. Here's chapter 4. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin, I can't read that, heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zeb and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." All right, so they start building the temple. They start gathering the materials to build the temple. The neighbors come around them and say, "Hey, we'll give you a hand. We've been here for a while. We worship your God. Let us help." Sounds very nice. But they're identified as enemies, which tips us off that something might be going on here. Who are these people? These are people who have been relocated here probably by Assyria, who was the first empire to conquer this area. And they would have resettled refugees and exiles as well. And so there are people that are placed here who come to live in this land, and the land is known for the God Yahweh, so yeah, they probably have some sort of worship of Yahweh, but they also bring along with them the other gods that they also worship. So they're here in this area, and they make this gesture of, seems like goodwill, we'll help you out. Why are they offering to help? What do you reckon? Should Zeb and Joshua accept their offer of help? I don't know, seems innocent. Let's see what happens. But Zeb, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answer, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." Then the people around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrated their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So Zerubbabel and Joshua decline the offer of help that the neighbors have given. Why? Well, perhaps there's some political sense in this. Cyrus has given them a command to a very specific group of people, so maybe they think, hey, if we start collaborating with lots of people in the area, it might seem like a threat. So maybe there's a little bit of political wisdom in what they're doing, but I think primarily it's a spiritual decision. Their response seems a bit cold. We alone will build it, Take your toys and go home. And it really probably should seem that way to us. They are departing from Israel's historic precedent here. Because time and again, Israel made whatever alliances would benefit them without consideration of what the ramifications would be. I don't know what you're susceptible to. We are all susceptible, I think, in different ways to different sins. We each have our own weaknesses. Someone can walk into a casino and have no problem walking out with their wallet full. Another person can walk into a casino and their mortgage can be in danger. Someone else can walk into a bar and have no problem having a drink, and another person can walk into a bar and it can be the start of a huge problem. I think of that. Maybe there's that person in your life. I've had this where it's like, gosh, every time I hang out with that person, all it is whinging and gossip, and that's all we do. And I need to be careful when I hang out with that person because, gosh, we're susceptible to that sin when I'm in that situation. Or maybe it's after 8 p.m., what possible good things are you doing on your phone? It's like, turn off your phone after 8 p.m. What are you doing? You're either spending an hour wasting time or ending up on websites you shouldn't end up on, or we are all susceptible to different things that we need to guard ourselves against. And Zerubbabel and Joshua here have a keen sense of what the people of God are susceptible to. Time and again, Israel made whatever alliance would benefit them. Former kings and rulers chose expediency and compromise over obedience to God. And perhaps Zerubbabel and Joshua are considering the offers of these neighbors, but they remember the similar kinds of offers that Ahab and the other terrible kings of Israel had accepted in the past, which had led them down the road to unfaithfulness. They are recovering idolaters. And here they choose not to work alongside a group of people who have some connection to Yahweh, sure, but they would also show them who else to make sacrifices to in order to get the job done quicker. Zerubbabel and Joshua show discernment, and they depart from a generational sin of complicity. They understand the work God has called them to. They understand the work God has created them for. So they decline the offer, and we sort of see the true colors of these neighbors immediately. It's very clear that those people were not interested in actually helping rebuild the temple. They weren't actually interested in helping resettle this group of exiles. They go to work bribing the tradies and contractors. They begin threatening the work with violence. They have no genuine interest in being helpful. It's sort of like, the decision that they make turns out to be the right one, right? It's like going for a job interview and then declining the job and the interviewer, lashing out at you or getting some vitriolic email that only confirms your decisions. Like, thank the Lord I did not take that job. They turn down the help, and it turns out to be the right decision. But unfortunately, the bribes and discouragement are effective, and they stop working on the temple. They turn down the offer of help. They say, no, this is our project to do. And as soon as there's resistance to what they're doing, they stop working. From 536 to 520, for 16 years, there's no work done on the temple. So God's people meet confrontation with conviction, but they lack resiliency. They have conviction without resiliency. They know what God has created them to do. They know what God has called them to, but when met with resistance, they fold, and they settle for something else. When I was thinking about confrontation, I thought of our partners, Open Doors, an organization that works with the persecuted church, a church that is constantly being met with confrontation. And I read the story of a church in Sri Lanka recently attacked by monks and villagers. The gate was torn down, the services interrupted week after week, but the pastor persisted not only in leading worship every week in the face of violence, but in preaching love of enemy. And I read the story of neighborhoods in Pakistan, Christian neighborhoods in Pakistan, where homes and churches were broken into and Bibles and scriptures gathered into huge piles to be burned. And they said their faith was only strengthened as they found protection in their sovereign king, meeting confrontation with conviction and resiliency. So we need to have conviction about what God has called us to do. But we need conviction that has the quality of resilience. What has God called you to do? What did God create you for? And what conviction and resilience do you need to do it? Let's move on to chapter 5. So that's chapter 4, confrontation, conviction, and resilience. Chapter 5, all right, a few more nicknames. Haz, Zachy, and Taz. All right? All right, so here's Ezra 5, 1 and 2. I don't have it up here, but here's Ezra 5, 1 and 2. Now, Haggai, Haz, the prophet, and Zechariah, Zachy. So now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Edo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, son of Jozadak, set to work rebuilding the house of God in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. Okay, so in chapter 4, we see God's people offered to interact with foreigners and outsiders who would lead them down the path of idolatry, and they say no, right? Good job, breaking with historic precedent. Here we see a chapter that begins with the prophets. There's been 16 years, right? So they stop working on the temple. 16 years, nothing's happening. Well, not nothing. We'll hear what's happening. 16 years of idleness, and then the prophets come along and prophesy. And what do we expect in Scripture when the prophets come along and prophesy? We expect the leaders to have their heads in the sand and for God to say, listen, there's going to be consequences. But here we see them breaking with another historic precedent. The prophets prophesy, and Zerubbabel and Joshua say, got it, we're on it. So here we go. They start rebuilding the temple again. Good on them. All right, they're paying attention. These are a couple of good leaders. Whatever Haggai said to the people was effective. Gosh, I wish we knew what Haggai said. We do. We have a book called Haggai. So there's a whole book called Haggai, and there's a book called Zechariah. So one of the things I love about a sermon series like this is that we get to know Ezra and Nehemiah, but now we can also slot in some of these minor prophets that when you're just reading through them, you're like, this doesn't make any sense. But now we get to see, okay, so 16 years, they've been doing nothing. And then Haggai comes on the scene. Haggai chapter 1. Here's Haggai chapter 1. In the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? Now, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages, only to put them in a purse with holes in it. So Haggai's prophecy gives us some insight into why the people stopped working on the temple. Perhaps their resolve is not quite as strong as it appeared early on in the story. It says, so is it time for you yourselves to be living in paneled houses? Putting the panels on the houses was sort of the last stage of building the house. So it was like, is it time for you to be living in finished paneled housing? Give careful thought to your ways. You've planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You put on clothes, but you're not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. Now notice in this word from Haggai who it is that's being harmed by their apathy, their disobedience. You know, Haggai doesn't come to them and say, God's really angry with you. I mean, he might have come and said that, but Haggai speaks a prophetic word to the deep longing in the people that is being unmet. You eat, but you're never satisfied. You drink, but you never have your fill. You top up your bank accounts, chasing after a little bit more, which you will never reach. The opposition from outside caused the people of God to become self-centered. Rather than believe in God's vision of restoration, the oppression they faced caused them to limit their ambitions, to shrink their goals, to lose sight of God's plan for them. They navel gaze, and Haggai reminds them, is this really what God called you to? Is this really what you were created for? Improving your cul-de-sac. Did God bring you back from Babylon with the favor of kings in order to add a little sunroom? No. You are doing 100 things, but you're ignoring the thing that I created you for. You're ignoring the call that brought you back to this land. Well, yeah, but as soon as we tried to do what you asked, there was resistance. Yeah, of course there was. Yeah, but we got pushback. The minute we started to press into your kingdom, they started saying mean things about us. I know, of course. And this whole time that you've been building onto your own houses, they haven't said a word. You can hear the words of the people in Haggai's words, where he says, the people say to me, the time has not yet come. You can hear that rationalization, can't you? All of this opposition, God must want us to wait until the path forward is really clear and easy before we press into this. Well, the time has not yet come. Let's be sensible. Let's wait. It reminds me of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, where he's writing to the white church, basically saying, you know, you keep telling me that I'm moving too quickly, that I'm pressing for too much justice, that I'm insisting on things that I should wait for. He's frustrated with people who, quote, paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. They live by a mythical concept of time and constantly advise the Negro to wait for a, quote, more convenient season. And he reminds the church that the pursuit of God's justice in the world are always met with resistance. Seeking God's righteous shalom in our world is always inconvenient. And it always inconveniences those who it presses against. For 16 years, the people of God put aside what God has called them to do. They busy themselves, but their busyness never satisfies them. And without God's prompting, they do nothing. It's God's action at the beginning of each step that enables them to wake up and move. God moves, and they're able to be free from exile. For a while, they're obedient, and then they sort of 16 years, they ignore what they're supposed to be doing. And without God's prompting, they would do nothing. They don't build the temple. They're fine. And religion has sometimes been called the opium of the masses, and maybe you can find some examples of that in history, but this is the great story of how untrue that is. The accusation that faith deadens, dampens, darkens, dulls. Man, we're dead already. And we see here, without God's prompting, they were destined for absolute banality, drab, pedestrian, ordinary, wearisome, anxious. Haggai and Zechariah are the mouthpiece of God to awaken a generation and remind them of the task before them. People think of the church and religion as boring, but it's not the God of the Bible you're serving if it's boring. Show me someone who's phone addicted, Netflix binging, YouTube scrolling, fear-mongering, TikTok swiping, refreshing the page, hoping something interesting and enlivening will come along. Small dreams. That's someone who hasn't met the living God. And I'll tell you what, I am that sort of person. I am that person, save for the grace of God. It's God's voice that says, no, read something beautiful, say something kind and ambitious, take a risk on a person, knock on that door, go on that trip, invest in the planet, not just in your pockets. Believe in the resurrection, build something that will change your life, learn something that will expand your mind, do something ambitious and generous and grand. And Haggai and Zechariah are the prophetic voices that echo down the canyons of time and wake the people up to a reality that is far bigger than the houses that they are renovating. When we find ourselves spiraling down into our phones or our fears, we need the word of the Lord to come from friends who are like Haggai and Zechariah, friends who believe in us, friends who remind us of the bigness of God, people who help us fix our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, people who call out the gifts in us and remind us of what we were created for. So the prophets prophesy, and the people respond. It's a miracle. And they start rebuilding the temple. And they begin rebuilding the temple, and it catches the attention of Tattenai. Tattenai is the Persian governor over this area. And he notices what they're doing, and he says, hold on. It's 20 years, 2 decades of nothing going on here. Now all of a sudden, you're bringing in these huge shipments of timber and stone. What's happening? And so most of chapter 5 is them explaining to Tattenai what's been going on. And Tattenai writes a letter to Darius saying, hey, these people say Cyrus sent them here, because Darius is now king. These people say Cyrus sent them here, that they're allowed to do this. Just want to check with you. So he sends this letter off to Darius, and that gets us to chapter 6. And in chapter 6, we get a message back from Darius. Darius goes into the archives, finds confirmation of what they say, and Darius sends a very long letter back. So chapter 6 is quite a long letter from Darius saying, yeah, we went and we looked in this archive, we didn't find it, we eventually went to this archive, we did find it, and Darius confirms and goes over the top of what even Cyrus said. He says, yes, leave them alone, let them build, and I want to pay for everything. I want to pay for all the supplies, I want to pay for the sacrifices needed for once they have the temple finished, I want to pay for everything. And so Tattenai comes back with that response, gives the thumbs up, and the people are like, cool, this is great. And then in verse 13 of chapter 6, then because of the decree of Darius, Tattenai, governor of Trans-Euphrates, and Shethar-Bozenai and their associates carried it out with diligence. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai and the prophet Zechariah. They finished building the temple according to the command of God and the decree of Cyrus and Darius. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. March 12, 515 BC. The second temple is finished and dedicated to God. This is a huge deal. And it actually receives kind of shockingly small amount of chapters in the Bible. It's the 3rd major building project in the scriptures. There's the tabernacle, which gets basically half the book of Exodus to describe. You get the first temple, which gets chapters in Chronicles and Kings. And then you have this building project, which is now completed. So, this is the end of chapter 6 here. So we'll talk through this, and then we'll come to our celebration of Passover and communion this morning. So on the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated the Passover. Let's just pause a second. So on the 14th day of the first month, the exiles celebrated Passover. So 6 weeks after the temple is finished, they gather together to celebrate Passover. This is, again, remember, we're at the end of the Old Testament here. This is the 6th time Passover is celebrated in the Old Testament. 1,000 years. This is the 6th time that it's celebrated, which is shocking. It's celebrated first in Exodus 12. I don't know, this is a lot of content, but Exodus 12 is the first time Passover is celebrated, and then this is the last time. And it sort of makes these bookends, right? The first Passover celebrates God's people being liberated from slavery and told that, this is who you are. You are the people that I rescued from slavery. And then now towards the end of the Old Testament, we get this celebration of Passover. They're freed from exile. This is who you are. You are my people that I've freed from exile. You're the people that I've saved, my covenant people. And in between, there's only 4 other times where it's actually celebrated. And 2 Kings actually makes a point to say they neglected celebrating Passover. And so, yeah, it's remarkable. They celebrate Passover together. The priests and Levites had purified themselves and were ceremonially clean. The Levites slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the exiles, for their relatives, the priests, and for themselves. So the Israelites who had returned from exile ate it together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors. Oh, no, that's an important verse. Sorry, I read that. Oh, yeah, this one. So the Israelites who had returned from the exile ate it, together with all who had separated themselves from the unclean practices of their Gentile neighbors, in order to seek the Lord, the God of Israel. For 7 days they celebrated with joy the festival of unleavened bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy by changing the attitude of the king of Assyria, so that he assisted them in the work on the house of God, the God of Israel. So the people who had been unsatisfied, who had built bigger barns, who had allowed the pressure of outsiders to make themselves look inward for satisfaction, now experience great joy, and they share a meal together as one people. And notice in verse 21, they even invite some of those people, some of those neighbors who had separated themselves. Some of those neighbors come and join them. And it's a beautiful feast and celebration. And for 7 days they celebrate with joy because the Lord had filled them with joy. And when you think back of that moment in your life, when you were doing what you were created to do, I am sure that it was a moment marked with joy. So in chapter 4, the people of God are met with confrontation, and they respond with conviction, but they lack resiliency. In chapter 5, the prophets show up, and they remind them of who they are and what they were created to do. And in chapter 6, God makes a way beyond what they would ask or imagine. When they begin to press into what God created them for, God opens the door and makes it more possible than they thought. And they end by celebrating Passover together. And we're going to celebrate communion together now. Today is actually Pentecost Sunday. So there's Christmas and there's Easter. 7 weeks after Easter is the celebration of Pentecost. And it's the day in which the church was born, the day that we remember the Holy Spirit coming upon the 120 people gathered. And what happens? Those people go out and preach the good news, and everyone in Jerusalem who's gathered there hears it in their own language. Haggai prophesies to the exiles in the book of Ezra, and he casts a vision for them of what will happen in the temple and in Jerusalem. And he says, one day God will shake the heavens so that all nations will come to the temple. And Zechariah prophesies to the exiles in Jerusalem and says, people will come, trust me, people will come, inhabitants of many cities to Jerusalem. Many peoples and strong nations will come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem. And on Pentecost, so they do. People from every nation have gathered together, and here the Spirit of the Lord fulfills what he has begun already in the book of Ezra. The people hear the good news of Jesus in their own native language, and the words of Haggai and Zechariah find their fulfillment. And this meal has been the central act and central image through which God's people have always remembered who they are and who they were created to be. The exiles gather around this meal when they've completed the work set before them. And we gather around this meal this morning. The God who created you is the one who invites you to this meal. You were created to worship. And the God who knows you best is the God that loves you the most and invites you to this meal this morning. God's people in Ezra 6 remember that they were created to worship. They're created to be God's own. You were created to worship. You were created to be loved and known by your Creator. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he was with his disciples at a table, and it was the final meal that he would share with them. And towards the end of that meal, he took bread, and he broke it, and he gave it to them and said, "Take, eat, all of you. This is my body, which is broken for you. Every time you do this, do so in remembrance of me." And in the same way, he took the cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them and said, "Take, drink, all of you. This is my blood poured out for the forgiveness of many. Every time you drink of this, do so in remembrance of me." This is Christ's table, and he is the host. And you are welcome to come and take a piece of bread and take one of the cups of juice. And once you take it, why don't you bring it back to your seat, and we'll all take it together. So in a moment, we'll invite you to come down the middle aisle, and then you can go to whichever side and take a piece of bread and take a cup, and then return to your seats with it, and then we'll take the elements together. There's no pressure or obligation. If this is an unfamiliar practice to you that just doesn't make sense of where you're at with faith, please, there's no obligation or pressure to come forward at all. But it is Christ's table, and it's his invitation, and so you're welcome to come forward. So before we do that, let's pray. God, thank you for feeding us at your table with your grace. We thank you for the sacrifice that you made through your Son, Jesus Christ, to pay for the sins of the world, and that through him we can stand before your throne with confidence. Pray that as we come forward, we would, by your Spirit, just have a keen sense that you are the God who created us, who knows us best and loves us the most. In Jesus' name, amen.